The kind of Christian who makes everyone else feel like they're not trying hard enough is secretly the most hollow person in the room. Not always, but more often than anyone admits. There is a very specific person sitting in churches right now who hasn't missed a Sunday in years. They lead the small group. They have the prayer journal, the one that's actually filled in. They show up early and stay late. From the outside, they look like exactly what discipleship is supposed to produce. The kind of faith that other believers quietly measure themselves against. And at 11 p.m., when the house is quiet, they feel something they have never said out loud. I am exhausted and I don't know who I am anymore. This isn't a story about drifting. It's not about secret sin that crept in or a season of doubt or a faith that got distracted by the world. This is the story of someone who stayed, who committed everything, and discovered that staying on its own doesn't produce the life Jesus actually described. Because the diagnosis they keep receiving, pray more, fast more, serve more, is the exact prescription that's been draining them spiritually dry. And if that's not named correctly, the most devoted Christian in the building is the one most quietly at risk of walking away from God entirely. Not in an explosion. In a slow, invisible exhaustion that looks from the outside like faithfulness. There is a passage in Luke 15 that almost nobody preaches. Not the part everyone knows, not the prodigal who left, spent everything, and came home to a waiting father. Everyone preaches the prodigal. I'm talking about the other son, the one who stayed. The one who never wasted anything, never disobeyed, never left the property, the elder son. When the younger brother comes home and the father throws a feast, music starts, and the elder son is still in the field, working. He hears the celebration from a distance and refuses to go in. His father comes out to him, and what the elder son says next contains the entire anatomy of Christian burnout. He says, I have been serving you like a slave. In the original Greek, the word he chooses is doulo, to serve as a slave, not as a son, not as an heir, as a slave. In his own father's house, after a lifetime of devotion, after years of prayer, obedience, consistency, the person who had inherited everything described his own life in the language of servitude. That gap between performing the acts of a son and actually living as one is exactly where spiritual dryness takes root in the most committed believers. Not from neglect, not from rebellion, from the wrong source. Here's what makes this so dangerous. A hired hand and a son can do identical work. They can keep the same schedule, follow the same rules, maintain the same outward commitment for years without anyone noticing the difference. The activity looks the same. The difference isn't in the hours, it's in the why. The hired hand works to keep his position. The son works because it's his father's house and he loves what his father loves. In John 10, Jesus describes the hired hand, and he says something quietly devastating. When danger comes, the hired hand runs. Not because he's weak, because the sheep aren't his. His entire relationship to the flock is transactional. He has no personal stake in what he's protecting. The elder son had been managing his father's estate with that same hired hand's heart. Every act of devotion was mentally deposited into a ledger. Every prayer, every sacrifice, every year of faithfulness, recorded, tracked, waiting to be recognized. And when the father threw a party for someone who had wasted everything, without a ledger entry in sight, the elder son's entire accounting system caught fire. This isn't fair because in his mind this was always a transaction, and the transaction had been violated. That is not a bad person. That is someone in pain. That is a person who has been performing the role of a faithful son without ever receiving the reality of being one, the behaviors of devotion, the internal experience of a contract worker. The Apostle Paul saw this same condition developing in a community of devoted believers in Galatia, and he asked them directly, having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? The Galatians weren't backsliders. They weren't people who had walked away from God. They were adding more religious practice, more discipline, more visible devotion, and Paul's response wasn't encouragement. It was an alarm, because when effort becomes the primary engine of spiritual growth, when identity in Christ gets quietly replaced by performance for God, what gets produced isn't fruit, it's spiritual dryness. And this is where Jesus' words in John 15 become something more than a metaphor. He doesn't say produce fruit. He says, abide in me, remain. The Greek word meno is the language of belonging. A branch doesn't produce fruit by working harder. It produces fruit by being connected to something that is already alive. The life flows from the connection, not from the branch's effort. But here is what almost no one says about spiritual dryness in devoted Christians. You can be extremely active in service to the vine while slowly disconnecting from it. Activity is not the same as abiding. Consistency is not the same as connection. The most active branches can be the most disconnected ones because the constant activity becomes the substitute for the life source. The noise of service drowns out the silence where something actually lives. The elder son was in the field working every single day, and 20 yards away a feast was happening that he couldn't hear. This is where Romans 8 stops being comfort and becomes a diagnostic. Paul writes to believers who are already living in God's household, "You have not received a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption by which we cry, Abba, Father." He's not writing to outsiders. He's not writing to people who are questioning their faith. He's writing to people who are in the house and warning them that it is entirely possible to live in the Father's house while operating from the internal architecture of a hired hand. The spirit of slavery doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like exhausted devotion. It looks like a prayer life that feels transactional. It looks like someone going through motions that used to carry meaning and no longer do. It looks like Christian burnout in someone who hasn't missed a service in 3 years. The word Abba in Aramaic is not a formal religious address. It's what a small child says when they run into a room and throw their arms around someone without asking permission, without earning the embrace first, without calculating whether this moment has been sufficiently prepared for. It is the sound of a person who knows, not intellectually but in their body, that they belong here, that this is their home, that the person in front of them is already theirs. The most devoted Christian experiencing spiritual dryness has often not lost that theology. They can tell you what Abba means. They can explain the doctrine of adoption in Romans 8. But somewhere between the knowledge and the experience, they have been running their relationship with God like a contract worker, performing for an inheritance they haven't let themselves receive. And then the Father says it to the Son standing furious outside the feast, and it lands like something that was always true. "Son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours." Not will be yours, not could be yours if you perform well enough. It already was. The Son hadn't been working toward becoming the heir. He already was one, he just didn't know how to live as one. Spiritual renewal for the devoted, burned-out Christian doesn't come from adding more discipline or more structure or more sacrifice. It comes from a shift at the level of source. Not serving for God's acceptance, but serving from it. Not striving to remain in the vine, but learning what it actually feels like to be a branch that belongs. The prayer life doesn't stop. The calling doesn't disappear. The transformation is invisible to everyone watching. But you know the difference. The branch doesn't produce fruit to prove it's connected. It produces fruit because it is connected. That's not a strategy, that's an identity. Luke 15 ends with a door left open. After the Father speaks, we never find out if the elder son walked into the feast. The story just stops. Luke doesn't close it because Jesus didn't close it. He was telling it to the most religiously devoted people in the room, the ones who had been managing God's property the longest, and he left them standing at the edge of the celebration, with an open invitation they hadn't decided about yet. That question is still open. The Father is not at the door of the feast waiting for you to serve better. He is standing outside where you're working, in the field you haven't left in years, asking you to stop managing the property for long enough to come inside and eat. The feast is already happening. The table already has your name on it. The only question left is whether you'll put down the ledger and walk in.